Hi, everybody. Welcome to From Demo to Master, our four-part mixing course on waves.com. I'm Dave Darlington, and today is part 3, putting some meat on those bones about the harmonic instruments. Before we dive in, I want to thank everybody for participating and for a lot of the nice feedback I've been getting from all over the world. And I just want you guys to know it's really appreciated, and I'm glad that you're finding the information useful. And I also want to thank the giant support team that we have at Waves. There's a lot of guys behind the scenes making everything flow smoothly, so thanks to them. And the last reminder is that there's a coupon. If you buy any plugin that we use here in the course, up until the culmination of the course next week, if you type in DD15, that's my initials, Dave Darlington, DD15, you'll get 15% off anything that we use in the course. Okay, so that's it for shameless commercialism, and now we're going to jump into some questions and answers that you guys have been sending in. I'd like to introduce my buddy Gitai, who's going to moderate.
Hey Dave, how are you?
I'm good. How you doing, man?
Doing good actually.
Okay, what do you got for me today?
Well, I'm looking at the questions. I see that a whole bunch of people are asking questions about how to mix rich sessions with a lot of instruments that are fighting for the same space in the mix. So the first one, we have Cooley Cod.
Hey, Cooley.
And Cooley asks, he says that he EQs almost all his instruments, pianos, guitars, etc., and try to cut out the frequency that overlap with other parts of the mix. But he's asking, is there such a thing of cutting too much out? Should you avoid EQing too much? Is there such a thing as EQing too much?
Well, of course. I think that's one of the main things I talk about in all the episodes is everything I try to do with plugins and stuff, I try to do as little as I possibly can to avoid like really reshaping the source sound unless I'm going for a certain effect like a distortion or something like that. But particularly when it comes to compression and EQ, there's always too much. When it comes to separating things by frequency one from another, that's also a little bit of a slippery slope. Of course, things are going to build up in certain areas like lower mids and upper transients. But let's say, for example, an electric bass, that's a bass instrument. If you take out all the highs, it's not going to really sound like a bass anymore because a lot of what defines it as a bass is the string overtones and sometimes even the fret rattle. So you have to use, you have to be judicious about that. Now, EQ is not your only option. We have a lot of other options, which I'm sure we're going to touch on in the course of the hour. But in general, don't necessarily EQ everything. Listen to things in solo and then in groups. Let's say you have a lot of guitars fighting for the same space. So pick out certain parts and feature them, sculpt them a little bit with EQ to get them where you want them, and then add the next layer and see what that layer is doing. And that way you'll avoid maybe overdoing it.
Great. Well, Paul asks a similar question. Hi, Dave. After adding many tracks of guitars, keys, etc., you can get to the point that you can lose hearing some really good parts.
Yeah, of course.
To get those parts to re-emerge, do you mostly use automations and level changes, or do you mostly work with EQ to carve out spaces for these parts to be heard? And he mentions that he loved how in the previous lesson, Andrew Sheps suggested how some parts re-emerge through subtle panning.
Yeah, Andrew's kind of a wizard at this kind of stuff, where there's a lot of stuff going on, but you can hear everything. So the answer to your question is that all hands on deck. Every tool in the arsenal, which would be panning, compression, EQ, arrangement, side chaining sometimes, where we move things out of the way of each other. That can all be automated too, so the side chain can just pop on. But I don't think there's one single approach. The first thing to get is a general balance of everything, and then after that, sculpt the tone a little bit, as you saw as I worked through the mixes, and then I might go back and work on the balance some more, and then I might work on the tone some more. So it's a process, a sifting process. But the short answer is that all the tools available all come into play in every genre, in almost every song.
Would you care to show us a few of these
Well,
things?
let's see. We have this the Doip Death Over IP song with all these guitars. Look how many guitar parts we have. Let me play a little bit of this to refresh your memory.
Divided, we stand.
I'm gonna skip down here where a lot of things are playing. So we have this guy. And if you remember in the episode, I EQ'd each part on its own and compressed it on its own. So even though those are doing the same function, they're EQ'd a little bit differently so that your ear can hear them. Like for example, here we're boosting 400, and here in this one we're boosting much lower, down in the sub bass. And then the third one, this is a little bit similar, although we're cutting out a little bit more of the upper mids and the low mids and the upper mids. So you see there's a slight difference in EQ in those three parts, which are all doing the same function, but it allows you to hear them a little bit separately so that each component has got its own identity. And then you got to watch out for things like big pads, because keyboard sounds, particularly keyboard sounds that come from modules, are the programmers make the sound so that when you go in the music store and play them, they sound like the voice of God is speaking. That's how they get you excited about the keyboard. It wouldn't be so great to go into Sam Ash and play something and it sounds a little bit small and nasally, but maybe with all those guitars and this giant choir. So here's an example of maybe in that case. Let's get a little something simple like Renaissance.
You got a lot of plugins there.
Yeah. So maybe filter, right? Take some of that low out. To get that out of the way of these low guitars here. So you're still getting the air from the choir voices, but they're out of the way of the guitar. Now, as I was working through these mixes, obviously I was working pretty quickly. I didn't feel that choir was overly low-key down there in that low mid-range, but that's maybe an example of a technique that I might use. What do we need the choir for, right? We want to hear that ah sound, the air of the ah sound, more than necessarily those low mids, which are in the area of the guitars. So it's partly thinking like an arranger, as I spoke about many times. Think about the music and the importance of each part in the arrangement before you just go slapping on EQs and whacking things out of shape. Use the EQs as a tool, not as a necessity.
Well, we got another one. It's a related question, but it's a little more focused about the low mids.
Yeah.
It's from Arseny, and Arseny asks, Dave, I have found that when there are a lot of instruments competing in the mix, especially in orchestral arrangements, the low mids tend to overload.
Yes.
Is there a way around this without too much compression or limiting, and while still getting all the instrument vividly heard?
Yeah, my favorite technique for getting rid of the low mids, if you remember on my routing scheme, there was a music bus and a vocal bus. So a lot of times on that bus, I'll use an EQ. You see right here where I'm dipping out some like around 250, 300. That's the part where it builds up. So I would work without that for the course of while I'm working to try to get the sounds as good as I can without an overall EQ. And then that's almost like a little bit of a mastering job, so sucking out a little 325, a little 280, 290, somewhere in there it's just going to build up. And another way to find out about that is to play it on poor speakers, because those Bluetooth speakers that you buy to go away to college and stuff, those always have a little bump in the bottom because you want to hear the bass in pop music, so they add bottom. And when you have too much in that low mid range, that really shows up. I have my little Bluetooth guy over here, and that's where I find out about that stuff. And also in headphones, you can really hear that stuff. So, of course, I do suck it out a little bit, and then I also use something like this, the C4, a multiband guy. In this mix, I wasn't, but if I turn it on, actually, I was. So that's compression / limiting, depending on how strong your knee is set. Limiting is a 90-degree knee. But you see that it's actively taking that out when there is too much, but not at other times. So if it breaks down and it's a vocal and a little piano lick, the vocal's going to be warm and full because we're not sucking out 300. We're not sucking out 250. But when everybody comes in and all the toms are rolling and the bass part and the Moog part, there's too much energy, so you can see it working here. And if I go strong with it, you'll hear that it's too much, and you feel scooped out. You feel it missing. And you also see that it never lets up in this particular section of the music because there's so much going on all the time. So when I'm using this kind of dynamic processing, meaning over time, in other words, it's working when it needs to and not working when it doesn't need to, I like to see it let go. And that goes for most of my compression too. I don't like to just see it sitting there like that all the time, unless I'm using that for an effect, like a power guitar. Possibly I would do that. But something where it's the whole record, even if it's hard rock or hip hop or something, I want it to breathe and have some push and pull. You actually can see in that example that it's kind of reacting to the low end of the snare. Now, I like having that low end of the snare because it hits me in the chest, but in the face of all that other stuff going on, it's masking some of those frequencies. So that's just another one of the tools that you can use.
Well, we got a question coming all the way from Nicaragua.
Okay.
We got Alejandro, and he asks, what's your favorite compressor to use on a mid-range instruments like guitars, and why?
Guitar, well, I don't have a favorite per se, but I do tend to lean towards the CLA 76, which is, of course, modeled after the 1176. And those have just proven over time to be such great guitar compressors, but it's certainly not the only one. The thing about that is it's solid state. It can be very quick, and you can have it release very slowly. It's, independent attack and release time. So you get the same kind of sustain you might get from a stomp box, which guitar players, of course, love because it makes the tone sing. But they're also very aggressive and they're very sharp. The API 2500 is a really good mid-range, sharp compressor. You kind of don't want anything that's smooth and soft in respect to those mid-range instruments.
We got a question from Lucas.
Lucas?
And Lucas asks, do you have any recommended attack and release settings on a compressor to deal with specific types of instruments? You already talked about vocals and drums. Can we talk about that for stuff like guitars and synth?
Yeah, I think in a general rule of thumb is you want it to be a little faster on guitars and synths because they're, a single transient with a longer sustain, whereas the drums you want to let that transient get through so it whacks, and then you want to compress it to sustain the sound. Now, of course, and like any rule, it doesn't apply all the time, but a quicker attack so that, as the guy's playing a lot of stuff, the compressor's reacting equally throughout the part. Kind of the idea with a lot of electric guitars and power rock and stuff like that, keep everybody in their lane, right? So that you don't have to do a ton of automation throughout the song. In fact, some of the greatest rock records were done before there even was automation, so they were using compression to regulate the part. If you think about the great Eddie Kramer records of Hendrix, those parts just sit so great because he was squashing the guitars. And so yeah, you want something aggressive. You want something with a pretty quick attack, and you can hit it a lot harder too. I find these kind of mid-range things because they occupy a certain place in the music and doesn't change that much over time.
Would you be able to show us a shootout between two of these options and see how they react
Yeah,
to the
maybe.
guitars?
Let's find those power guitars again. Okay. Now here I'm using Renaissance compressor, I believe. Right. Now Renaissance compressor is a digital compressor and it's just very flexible. You know, you can have all different kinds of settings. The compressors that are modeled after hardware are designed to follow the characteristics of that hardware. Where's CLA up here? So, of course, we have tons of great presets. So, let's see. We need to power some in here. That's the faster attack there. So I don't know if you can hear that through the speakers, but it imparts a certain tone, a little bit more aggressive, let's say, than the also very much louder. So you hear that mid-range bite that's imparted by that, and I find you're going to get that from the Pi. Let's just see if we can hear that. This is the one we ended up using, I think, on the drum room, and it's super aggressive. Let's see if they have a guitar. Well, let's try lead vocal. Like I say, the presets are just great starting points. You know, I'm just loading up some stuff to just see where it is. So you might want to lengthen the decay on something like a guitar. So that's the Pi versus. You can hear the Renaissance is a little smoother, you know, because we're not trying to emulate the characteristics of that circuitry. So the circuitry is part of the color. And, you know, certain records are known because they were made at certain studios and had certain colors like, you know, the Helios board at Olympic and the Neve boards at the other places. And the red desk also has that kind of characteristic that it's going to impart. That's the EMI desk that all the Beatles records and the Dark Side of the Moon and that kind of stuff was made on. So I'm kind of wandering off the point a little bit, getting into the analog color, but each of these analog things has their own color, like flavors of keyboards almost. Like, why would you choose a Wurlitzer over a Rhodes? Well, why would you choose a Pi over a Renaissance compressor? It's the same thing. It's going to play the same part and do the same job, but it's a little different color. So it's all part of our palette. That's why sometimes the bundles are better to buy than individual single things, because then you have a lot of modes to compare to.
So Lucas is still hungry for knowledge, and
Me too, Lucas.
and he asks, what about compressor settings on guitar leads? You know, like those cliff solos.
Yeah, it follows the same pattern. Let's go to our lead guitar solo here at the end of the song. Where is he? Down here, I believe. So once again, I'm using Renaissance. What a lazy engineer. He only went to his go-to guy. Okay, so this is mono. That's why it wouldn't let me copy. But let's just do a little shooting out here. Maybe try to find some other stuff. The Puig Child is another good vintage guy. This, if you see the pictures of the Beatles listening back to stuff in the control room of EMI, you see the 670 in the background and the 660 below it. This is the original vinyl compressor. So of course, as we turn up the threshold, we get more compression. Now, in this is of course modeled after the circuitry, so we don't have attacks and releases, but we have notches that were set in the circuitry, and you can, if you look in the help menu, you'll see exactly what each notch is, but just generally from faster to slower. So that's a Pultec color, a Fairchild color. And then let's go back to the Pi. So even on my little earbuds, I'm not listening in speakers today, so we don't get a feedback. But I can completely hear the difference in that color, and so I would maybe think that through in terms of the mix and what did I want from the color and what did I want from the aggression. Another good one for that kind of stuff is the API. Okay, so threshold. And this has tone controls, which are just circuitries, emulations. So this goes back to what Jack was talking about in terms of moving stuff through time with the attacks and releases, but also I find it much more about the color in terms of the palette. So when I'm thinking through the mix and looking at the arrangement, and I think Andrew would probably say the same thing, is, which color, which flavor of compressor would be the right one for this application. Now, bear in mind, they're all doing the same thing. They're all regulating the tone by attack and amount, by how fast and how much. But they all have their own circuitry, particularly the hardware ones. And so therefore they're going to have different colors. Just like the difference in guitars. Why would you pick a Stratocaster or why would you pick a 335? It's doing the same job.
Okay, so we have Simon, and Simon wants to know, is the Waves in-phase plugin good for treating stereo guitars as well? You showed how you used it on drums, so does it resolve phase issues between guitars as well?
Well, not two different guitars. Because that's two different parts, so you're really not going to have phase problems there. You might use it between two different mics in a guitar. I don't know that we have such a thing in my course. I can't think of any place where we have two guitars, but let's say you mic an acoustic guitar with a mic on the body and a mic on the neck, and if you misplaced them maybe a little bit, or if the person was wiggling around after you set it up, the idea is you want the mics to be the same amount of distance from the source, even if they're separated like an A-B situation, so that the sound arrives at the same time and doesn't smear. So in-phase would be really great for that. I wish I had something I could demo that with, but what in-phase does is it reads the two sources and it decides how different they are, and then you just move that little wheel until they line up. You can actually see it on the display. But that's for multiple mics more than multiple parts.
I would like just to remind our viewers that we're still accepting questions in the comment section at the bottom of the page. So keep them coming, guys. And we have a question from Dave. And Dave wants to know, how do you deal with the hum or buzz from amps or amp simulators? What is the best way to remove these noises?
Okay, there's a few ways actually. One is gating. And the easiest one of that is RVox. Even though it says Vox in the title, it's got a fantastic gate on the left-hand side. Let's see, we got any buzzy stuff here that we can show.
And also, Jim Johnson wants to know that he's asking about if you have any special technique to remove the noise but still keep the
Sure.
characters.
Unfortunately, these are so well recorded. There's not a ton of noise. Um, there's a bunch of stuff you can do. So okay, we'll just show the RVox, and this is really the same thing as a gate. This like the C1 gate, right here. Let me solo. So if this was an amp buzz, let's use our imaginations. Anytime that this signal, this blue signal, fell below where I have the threshold, this very elegant gate is going to close. It's not going to sound choky. It's not going to stutter. Okay, there's another. There's the other one that's primarily live oriented.
Well, the primary source expander.
The NS1.
Oh,
right?
The NS1.
Is that what I'm thinking of? Yeah. So this is the same thing as the gate with the function similar. So I've seen. I recently did a live show with front of house guy, and he uses this a lot because, of course, on live situations, you got stuff humming and bleeding everywhere. So that was his particular go-to. There's also, of course, the denoising plugins, which are a little bit more tricky to use, but how do you learn things? You experiment with them. So Xhum is primarily focused on notching frequencies out. So you see, if you have a 60 cycle hum like America or a 50 cycle hum like Europe, what this is doing is it's notching 60, 120, and on up in the harmonic series. Now, if that's all the noise is just a that comes from the plug when the ground plug is not set properly, this is great for that. If it's a little more complicated, we also have X noise and Z noise. Z noise is the more modern, fully developed sibling. And so what you do with this is you find a part. Now I use this. Whoops. Pro Tools quit. Technical difficulties. I'll just talk about it while we're rebooting. So what I do a lot with bad recording is you find a place in the music where the guitar is not playing, but you just have the hum or the ambience, and you press learn, and then it kind of measures and records the characteristic of the noise wave and separate it from the actual music. Then you have a threshold like a gate or a limiter or a compressor, and you just raise the threshold above where that noise is so that it starts to work, and then you tell it how much you want it to work. So you have to be a little bit careful because this is some psychoacoustic stuff. It's actually altering the tone, especially on some things like an electric acoustic guitar where you need a lot of that tactile part of the tone. You don't want to have that, so you don't want to mess that up. So you have to be very gentle with it, but it works really well. It works on a vocal that's got some noise behind it, or anything that's just got noise in it. So that's the high end, super algorithmic way of dealing with it. A gate would be the easiest.
Well, in the meantime, we got Asha, and Asha is asking if you can talk a little bit more about how you might approach panning when you have multiple guitars. He hears a lot about pushing things to maximum left-right panning, which makes some sense to him when working on a console. But in the digital realm, he finds that the hard panning sounds unnatural. And also, would you use spatial plugins on panned guitars to help account for the hard digital panning?
It's funny. I had this discussion while we were working on the show, and my instinct is if the part is exactly the same, to put it as wide as possible because it gives that feeling of like a pad that's opening up super wide. Whereas if it's a certain kind of rhythmic part on the left and a little bit different kind of part on the right, those can tend to be a little closer in, more in the stage of the band. But then I talk to other people who particularly work on rock a lot, and they say no, they don't pan their doubled guitars completely wide. Some are 9 and 6, some are 10 and 2 even. So I guess that has to do with your particular taste, and also I'm sure while you're working on your songs, you're listening to what other people are doing, and so each genre is going to have its aficionados of super wide versus not. And then now there's the new NX technology where even in headphones we have not only 2D but we have 3D up and down. So if you go to the NX page in Waves, you'll see some demos by a lot of different engineers. I have one mix in there, and some guys have quite a few. And the rhythm guitar player can be jumping up doing pogos behind your head. It's pretty incredible technology. So I guess it depends on what you're going for, and you also always have to shrink down to mono to make sure that things are going to still translate in mono.
So we got a similar question from Inar, and it's about panning, but not related to guitars. Now it's about keyboards.
Okay.
Is there a way to know when keyboards should be mostly centered versus off to the sides and equalize there? And can mid-side processing help in this type of situations?
Oh yeah, absolutely. First of all, almost all electronic keyboards that we generate in the box, all the soft synths and all that stuff are going to be super stereo. And the effects chain that might be on the end of the sound would even be more stereo, like a chorus or something like that. What I tend to do is try to keep the stereo field. Let's see what kind of keyboards we got here. Yeah, the grimy pad. So that's I have this as wide a stereo as I want. But if I was in a rock situation where I'm going to be fighting a lot of guitars, I might do something like that. Let's make that bigger so you can see it. So in effect, I'm actually shrinking the width, but I'm also tilting the sound one side or the other. Now you can see on this what he called una corda. I mean some single string that's like the piano with the third pedal down. Whoever programmed that sound has a panner on the sound. Watch, you can see it moving around in time. Whoops. So those notes are only a whole step and a half step apart, but the second note went all the way to the left. So that's built into the sound, and that's going to be on almost any kind of, if you have a keyboard module, like a Phantom or a Nord or something like that, that stuff is all going to be very, very wide. So you might consider doing something like that just to get them out of each other's way. Now, if it's a real sound, like a real piano, you have to think about where that piano is on the stage. So if I'm looking at the piano on stage, the guy's playing like this, I don't want to put the treble on the left and the bass on the right. In fact, quite the opposite. I want the bass on the left. As I'm looking at him, the low strings are going to be on the left and the high strings are going to be on the right. That to me is just staging, because if otherwise it's opposite of the way the piano is actually going to be. Now, if the piano's over on this side, on the right side of the stage, and the guy's looking across the stage, it's the other way around. Same with the Hammond organ. You have the rotary speaker at the top, and you have a different rotary speaker at the bottom. Generally, people mic the top with 2 mics and the bottom with 1. So the stereo field is whatever panning you have on the top 2 with the bottom one in the middle. Then you take that whole field and tilt it. Let's pretend that this is the organ for a minute, and it might be something like this with let's say the bass is for a moment up in the middle. If I want to put the organ on stage left, I have to respect that same panning. In other words, I'm taking the picture that I drew in the middle and I'm moving the whole picture stage left, or I'm taking that whole picture and I'm moving it stage right, keeping the 10 and 2, but moving it in my entire mix on one side. So I hope that's some of the information. But in general, the electronic keyboards and the VST stuff, that's going to be already super wide. I find myself narrowing it often because it's too wide and hard to hear that way.
Okay, so we got one from Danny.
Danny?
And Danny asks if you can share some of your favorite mid-side EQ or multiband compression processing technique for synths and for guitars.
Well, I'm not a big mid-side guy, but if I was, I would use that in the terms of bringing the meat forward. We're talking about meat on the bones. Sometimes the synths have so much sizzle and fizz and stuff on them that it's hard to hear the core of the note. So in that case, I might separate the mid side and bring, let's see if we can do that with this pad here, with our F6. Okay, so if we take the mid, and not here, we need here. And then I'm not even doing what I'm telling you. So let's start over. Factory default. Okay, there's mid. And then on the sides, I don't get it. I'm embarrassing myself here. Well, my idea was to bring the middle part up on the middle and then bring the middle down on the side, so the sides would have the sizzle and the mid would have the core. That's a general rule of thumb. But as I say, mid side is not something I go to as a default. I would just try to EQ the sound itself.
We got one from Ryan. And Ryan asks for any suggestion to mixing guitars, drums together so choruses land a little harder. Looking for ways to have my chorus section pop out more.
Yeah, we're going to address this in episode 4, which is about the automation and stuff. And that's kind of an automation technique where you might want to hit the drums on the very downbeat, just like you'll see when you get to episode 4. I did this in a couple songs where that first beat of the downbeat of the chorus is just ridden up a little bit. And of course, whatever level you are in the pre-chorus with your guitars, then you can bring them up a notch. So that to me would either be A, an automation issue, or B, an arrangement issue where more stuff comes in on the chorus. And that's of course always our goal, is to make the chorus pop.
And we got one from Alejandro. I'm not sure it's the same guy from Nicaragua, but he asks, if your client asks you for an analog tape machine type of mix, how would you approach your mid-range instrument like keys and guitars for achieving this type of sound and feel in the box?
Well, the thing about analog is it's a little probably warmer. And if somebody said that to me, the first thing I would do was put something across the master bus, like the Kramer tape or something, or the Abbey Road. At some point before the mix goes out the door, more than EQing anything to particularly do what I think tape might sound like, this is actually modeled after an actual tape recorder, and it's got the same kind of controls you would find on a tape recorder.
Quiero volver a empezar.
So now the thing about tape is you have to chill out on the level.
Quiero volver a empezar. Dejar otra vez todo atrás. Caerme desnudo en la tierra. Bañarme en las olas del mar. No.
So different speeds and different the noise and wow and flutter. Generally, of course, on a master, you don't want too much wobble. You don't want too much noise, but you're getting the sound of this tape going through the heads and then playing back. So more than EQ, I would just use a tape insert.
Ovidio, I think we
had a question from
yeah,
Ovidio
last time. Hi, Ovidio.
Welcome back.
He says, "Hi, Dave. How do you treat the highs in your mix between guitars or piano and vocals?"
Okay. Generally, you try to keep them out of each other's way by finding the spots where they're resonant. Like in the vocal part on last episode, you saw me take out stuff around 2500 in there. That's that bitey stuff. But maybe in the guitar, that's in the distortion guitars, maybe a little higher. And so you have to kind of learn it. As I was saying last time, you have to kind of learn frequencies and not pile up everything in the same place. That's the secret to that. Find out where the sound you're looking to enhance is the richest and enhance it there.
We got one from Paul, and Paul wants to know if you ever use an exciter to bring things out in the mix.
Yeah, I use exciter to solve some problems, like if something is a little dull or something like that. The Aphex is great for that. Let's see. What can we find here that's good for exciters? That's already exciting. Yeah, these are synth sounds, so they're already pretty bright. Okay, let's hear the Aphex on the piano. Actually, you hear the little sequencer part in the background. That the Aphex is bringing that out, so that might be an interesting thing. That's without. So that's what an exciter does. It just it looks for the overtones and gives them a boost. So that does bring a little rhythm there, and it brightens up the sound. So yeah, I would on a dull keyboard or something like that, an exciter could be great. In fact, on guitars, sometimes they're recorded really dull. If you're actually recording your guitars through an amp, guitar players tend to like the sound that comes back towards them to be warm, but sometimes that's not always the best thing in a mix. And so exciters can be your friend, but also the Signature series. Almost all the Signature series guitar stuff, as soon as you run it through there, you hear a shiny thing happening. CLA is a really good example of that, where, wow, with that on there, it's already much brighter and clearer. And they build that in because that's what they're going to have to do to the sound anyway. These guys that design the plugins have EQ'd thousands of guitar parts, so they know what the go-to settings are.
So we have Lucky Luke again, and Lucky Luke asks, what can I do to add some brightness back to my mix before the mastering phase?
Well, the real trick to mixing is getting all the tones to be right before it's summed. So you have to go through every part and make sure that it's bright. Don't EQ it where you don't have to. And I always try to do the EQing in the individual channels, and only that stuff I was showing earlier on the master bus, I put it there because I may need it, but I try not to use it. So the answer to that is, try to get all the sounds as clear and as clean as they can be in the context of your arrangement before the summing.
Here's one from James, and James would like to know, I've heard a lot of people say that piano is one of the hardest things to mix in a busy arrangement.
Of course.
And that's certainly my experience too. Can you explain why that is? I'm even interested in the theory behind that and what to do to handle a piano that just won't sit in the mix.
Well, the theory behind it is the reason the piano is such a beautiful sound is because the wave is extremely complex. It's basically a dulcimer. You have a hammer hitting a string, but when the pedal is depressed, the sustain pedal and the dampers are up, all those other strings are resonating harmonically, so the resulting sound is super dense, and you can have as many as 10 notes in one shot, and then if you hold the sustain, you can have another 10, so you can have tons of notes playing at the same time, all with harmonic density. So the theory behind it is that's why it's so hard to record, because it's a huge instrument. It covers a big area, and that's why it's so hard to get a sound that sounds natural and real, but fits into a mix and leaves room for anything else, because it covers the whole spectrum. So the theory is that in practice, you might have to brighten up the attacks up there in the 3K, 4K, and you might have to suck out some of that mid-range that's fighting with some of the other guys. It also depends on how hard you hit it. If you're using a VST piano, they have steps of dynamic control, a lot of them, and so the harder you hit it, of course, it's the sharper it's going to be. So I know a lot of guys that program the piano parts without thinking about the dynamic of the piano part. So then the resulting audio, we have to work a little harder, whereas if they maybe had just played it a little bit harder. So my reasoning behind saying that would be, maybe before you commit a virtual piano, experiment with the dynamic of your MIDI part and make it a little stronger and see if that helps, or make it a little softer if it's too sharp. So there's a couple of fronts that you can fight that battle on.
We have one from Rick. Rick is asking if you have any advice on how to wash out stacked synth patches that have a bit too much saw edge grittiness.
Mm-hmm.
Would phase shifting work in a situation such as this?
No, I would in that situation I would use more like the Q10 and like try to identify, fuzzy stuff. Let's see. Where's our guy that was really... Okay, so in this particular song, this is our lead sound, so we don't want to change him up too much. But up here, first of all, put it super small, and okay, so there's your first node of super unattractive buzz. And then it disappears beyond that, so there's one. And remember that the overtones it's a series, so sometimes the bad notes tend to be an octave apart. So here we found one kind of 5.5, and maybe one at 11. So that's one way to warm it up. Or you could just warm it up with a shelf if you don't like that buzziness. So a lot of times, when you're making the synth sound in the heat of creating the song, you end up with some parts of the tone that are not really ultimately the best. So that's when you use your EQ to sculpt it out.
We have Rudolph, and Rudolph says, "Hi, Dave."
Hey, Rudolph.
In the previous lesson, Andrew Sheps talked about parallel compression for multiple instruments.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I understood, and I'm wondering whether you could explain some more and maybe show us how to work with that?
Well, I think what he was talking about was having a bunch of different parallels, so that you're not putting everything into the same bus. So if you watched episode 1, we did a parallel drum bus. And that's I think all I did in terms of parallel. But let's say you wanted to have another. Let's just make a quick aux and put it to our key bus. Something new here. So we're going to send all the keyboards to that bus now. And then solo safe. Remember we talked about that. And then let's use something pretty dramatic like maybe the API. Okay, I'm going to turn it down while we set it up. Okay, and now if I put these on pre, we'll be able to mute the direct sound and we'll still hear the squash. Okay, so we're muting this. So you hear what happens in the squash. It's really tight and small and spitty, because we have the transients coming through. So then when you mix it in, so it almost doesn't really increase the volume, but it increased the presence. So I don't want to speak for Andrew, but what I remember what you're talking about, and I think he was saying that he uses a bunch of different parallel processes for different things. So maybe some for drums. Maybe he has different ones for cymbals and drums themselves. Maybe he has separate ones for vocals and separate ones for keyboards or guitar. So the thing is, you don't want that processor to be reacting to everything, because then it's kind of not doing what you're looking for. You're looking for it to enhance a specific sound. So if you're trying to enhance the drums and the keyboards are going into it, you're working against yourself. So I believe that's what he meant was having a bunch of different parallel processors that you could feed different things to at different times.
We have a question from John and a similar question from Mike. So I'm going to read them both, and hopefully one answer can cover both.
Yeah.
So John asks, got any tips about how to make single lead synth sound big and in your face? And Mike asks a similar question about guitars. Can you share some tips for making clean single note guitar parts as exciting and big as vocals would be and not tiny?
Well, that's a little bit of a tall order, but if it's me and I'm mixing, CLA guitars is one of the things I would go to for that. And you could also do saturation, like on the Shep's Omni channel. Saturate the frequencies for excitement. Compression is gonna hold it in place, and if you need to EQ it a little bit, that's going to be somewhere in the upper mids to bring out the actual melody parts and not so much of the pluck or the boomy bottom. But it also has a lot to do with your arrangement. The part in and of itself is relative to all the other stuff that's going on. So that would I think saturation would be my first, and then maybe distortion, the Manny Moroccan distortion, but not on a crazy setting, but just on a little sawtoothy feel to bring it to life. That would be another good way to do it.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Sure.
So let's pick up a question from Eric. And Eric would like you to please talk about how you're layering effects on instruments. And is each applied independently via sends, or are they applied in series? When should either approach be used?
I primarily use sends because coming from analog, you didn't want to tie up a whole effects unit on just one channel. So, that was the advantage of sends, is you could send a lot of different stuff to the same echo or the same reverb. So that's just a little bit of a built-in DNA to my thought process of using sends. But there's lots of times when inline in series would be great. Like the Kramer tape machine works great as a slap delay if inline. In terms of layering, that would be after you hit one kind of thing. Like let's say you send your guitar to a delay. Maybe that delay sounds dry in comparison to the guitar, so you might want to add the same reverb that you have on the guitar to the delay, so the repeats follow the sound of the guitar. Also, you can put chorusing and stuff. One of the cool things about the Manny Marroquin stuff is his verbs have phase and stuff built in after the verb. So you can have your verb and then you put another. It's actually in series, but it's a little phase shifting going on. So the verb is a little wobbly.
You've also mentioned that after a reverb, you might put something like a panner, an auto panner.
Yeah, we did that on the hard rock song, and it wasn't something that I would have thought of. But at no point in your career should you ever be closed-minded. Sometimes guys come in with just the wackiest stuff, and it's great. You think of guys like Joe Meek, Les Paul, wow, what if we had more than 2 tracks to record on? What would it be like? Some of the greatest stuff is invented, out of the blue sky. So never be closed-minded to like, this is the way I do it, and I know what I'm doing, so I'm going to do it my way. Man, I learn, I'm older than a lot of my clients, and I learn from them all the time. Some of the young kids that come in here with some crazy stuff, I put it right in my bag of tricks and pretend like I thought of it.
Very good. Well, it seems that we're approaching the end of the Q&A section. Do you have any final advice for people?
Well, most of today was talking about, how to get stuff to separate when there's a lot of things going on. One bit of advice would be to make sure that every part you're adding is meaningful. In other words, don't just keep, I think we need some more synths. I think we need some more guitars. If you remember the hard rock song that we had up earlier, there was quite a few guitars, but each guitar had a very specific thing that it was doing. Maybe it was 2 because we needed 1 on each side. Maybe it was a hard, edgy sound that we needed in the middle. 1 was a pluck, 1 was a lead. So at the end of the day, there were 5 or 6 guitars, but they all had meaning. My production style is, if it's not making the record better, it's out. Show me the part you have in mind. I'll listen to anything. I'll listen to it twice and 3 times and try to learn to love it. If it's not making the record better, then you don't need it. Now you've eliminated about a third of your fight, the panning problems and stuff like that. Then you go to these other tools, as we talked about. Use all the tools. First do levels, then do panning. Put them in a picture so they're not in each other's way. Now, if you have to, sculpt out some EQ. And then and compression, and then all the other things we talked about, automation and stuff. But it all starts with the arrangement. There's an old saying, a good arrangement mixes itself.
Well, that's very sound advice. I would like to thank you, Dave, for taking
My
time.
My pleasure, Guitar. It's been great. I want to say one more thing about when I was fooling around with the mid-side and had a brain cramp there. You have to select the band and tell it to be mid-side. So that's what we would want to do there. We want to maybe boost the middle, hit the M so that it goes to M, and then dip the middle and hit the S so that it goes to side. So I had a little momentary, like, why isn't this working? And that's why, because I want you guys to try to use that. It's a really good trick.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much.
Okay. See you next time, guys.